So our next unit of topic is the Cold War and how it connects to our last topic, which was war, but more specifically World War II. So we're going to kind of take this in three parts. Part one, just kind of describe the differences in philosophies between the two major nations competing for influence around the world. The second part, we're going to be looking at the reasons why they would want to compete, and how they got to the point where we get ourselves into the Cold War. And then the third part, we're really going to look at what the Cold War really was and how it was sort of fought until it eventually finally ended kind of in the early 1990s. So let's get going. So what you have in terms of the Cold War is at the end of World War II, you have two major superpowers. You have us, the United States, and you have the Soviet Union. But we had two very different philosophies in terms of types of governments and types of economies that we wanted to have. We had communism as one form of government and democracy sort of on the other end of it. So the philosophy behind communism as it came about in the Soviet Union was that the Soviet citizens were very tired of being run by the czars, who used to be just kind of like the kings, but they were czars, the rulers of the land, and they were just told what to do, typical kingdom type of situation. And what happens is the workers in the Soviet Union got fed up and were sick and tired of being kind of told what to do and feeling like they were lesser people. And so they kind of banded together, overthrew the czars during the communist revolution. And the idea behind it was that we're all workers, and so no one is better than anyone else. And we should all be working together for the good of all of us. And so based on the idea that we're all good people and equal, and no one's better and no one's worse, we should all have access to the same things, such as government programs. We should all have access to food. We should all have access to all the different things that we need to have in life. And in order to do that, we're going to put the people or the workers in charge, and we're all just going to work for the benefit of all of us. So to control that scenario, the government really is the only entity that's in a position to be able to make the kinds of decisions that are best for the nation as a whole, as opposed for an individual. And so what government does in a communist scenario is they make all of the decisions. They decide what kinds of jobs need to be created in order to produce the things that the nation needs. The nation needs certain kinds of foods. You need a certain amount of farmers, and so people are going to have to become farmers, and you're going to need doctors and lawyers, and you're going to need engineers and metal workers and people who work in manufacturing plants and all those kinds of things. And so the government is the one that has to decide how much of each one of those things to produce and what do we need. And so as an individual, you sort of don't have your own identity. You become a worker, and you don't get the freedom and opportunity to choose to do whatever it is you want to do. The government sort of decides what you're good at, and once they figure that out, then you end up going into that line of work. And everybody then has access to the same kinds of things, and whether you're a doctor or you're a farmer, you have access to the same food, and you go down and buy it from the same place, and you live kind of in the same type of home, and you kind of own the same kinds of things. And so everybody's working together for the good of everyone. And that's kind of the philosophy behind communism. In a democracy, we sort of look at it in a different way. We look at it not as government needs to control all of these things so that way we're always going to be equal. But in a democracy, we want to elect people into government to represent our needs and wants, and to kind of maintain order and peace and stability. But beyond that, we're all individuals, and if we want to become doctors or lawyers or farmers or whatever it is, that's our own choice. And if we want to make a ton of money, we can try to do that. And if we want to make a little bit of money, we can do that. And if we're successful, that's on us. And if we're not successful, that's on us too. And so it's a much more individualistic type of scenario. And the role government plays is, let's say, I have all the freedom in the world to do whatever it is I want to do. Well, I can't do things like go murder my neighbor. So the government has to set up certain rules and restrictions just to maintain peace and stability within society. And that's kind of what the government's role is. And we elect people in to make those kinds of laws and enforce those kinds of laws for the good of all of us. But we're very individualistic in that same sense. And that sort of goes along with a command economy, which is what communism is, meaning the government commands what gets produced and what jobs people have and how much they get paid and all that kind of stuff, versus capitalism, what we have with general democracies, which is everybody's can kind of do whatever they want, and you're free to open your own business or not, or make a lot of money or not, or buy whatever it is you want. Things like that are available, and we'll let people's needs and wants kind of drive what gets developed. So very different philosophies between our two nations, the Soviet Union and the United States. So at the end of World War II, as nations are rebuilding after being devastated during the war, they have to decide if they're going to become democracies, if they're going to become communist governments. And so the Soviet Union and the United States really start to try to influence different countries to join their side or become more like them. And so if we look at the reason why we started to compete with the Soviet Union around this is really about this. Right at the end of World War II, everybody's sick and tired of their neighbors fighting with them, right, and being invaded by them. And the Soviet Union was sick and tired of being invaded by Germany. It was the second time that had happened in 2 world wars, and they just didn't want to be invaded anymore. And same with England and France; they did not want to be invaded anymore. Well, one of the best ways in order to protect yourself is to create a barrier between you and your rivals, right? And so the best way to do that on a geographic scale or a geopolitical scale is to have smaller countries in between you and your major rivals, because now you're not right up against your rival. You've got some space in between. These countries are in between you and them, but you want those countries on your side, so if your rival wants to attack you, they've got to go through your allies first. So there were a lot of, the Soviet Union and the United States both, we were looking to make allies with a lot of different countries, because that also created a sense of security, and it also spread our philosophies, right? If we could get a bunch of people to become democratic nations, they would align with us, and they would help protect us against communist invasion. But there were also other countries that would trade with us and help us make money and all that other kind of stuff. And the same goes for the Soviet Union. So when we look at how it got started, because at the end of World War II, we were allies with the Soviets. They helped fight against Hitler in Germany. And what happened is, as the Soviet Union was pushing troops into Berlin towards the end of the war, and we were pushing troops in from the west into Berlin. Our troops, we kind of met in the middle right here in Berlin. And then once we realized that our two philosophies don't really match the same, and Hitler had committed suicide and they were out, what you had was both presidents now trying to vie for what's going to happen in Germany, because Germany is really kind of the one nation in between the Soviet Union and the rest of Western Europe. And so whatever happens with Germany is going to be a big deal for whichever nation sort of has that influence and that protective barrier. So of course the Soviets on the eastern side, they wanted to have Germany become a communist nation like them, and of course us on the western side, we wanted to have Germany become a democracy. So we start to notice that as we're vying for power and control over what Germany is going to become, we start to butt heads with our ally, the Soviet Union, right? And so what happens is the Soviet Union really pushed their troops deep into Germany and really kind of held Germany hostage. And for our part, because we did not want Germany to go the way of communism, we started to support the people living in Germany and in Berlin in particular with a tactic known as the Berlin airlift. And what we did is every day we would send hundreds of airplanes, cargo planes, in and land them into Western democratically controlled airports and drop off food and clothing and all kinds of other supplies so these guys could weather the storm of being held hostage by the communists. And eventually the communists couldn't continue to support this hostage taking and they backed out of there. And what they did is they retreated all the way to this line right here, which is known as the Berlin Wall. And they literally built a giant wall to separate the two parts of this major city. And so that really became the defining line between the West and democracy and kind of the Soviet Union in the East and communism. And so there was this massive wall built here right down the middle of the city. People had to be on either side and they weren't allowed to travel back and forth and that kind of a thing. And this was controlled by the communists and this was controlled by a democratic government and the West. And so that butting of heads over Berlin and whether or not it was going to become democratic or communism really threw us into what's known as the Cold War, where we were once warm friends and allies and worked together to fight against Hitler. We now had a very icy, cold relationship with them, and we really didn't like them, and we really saw them as our arch enemy. And that's why it's known as the Cold War, simply because it was a very icy relationship between the two nations. So if you look at sort of a map of Europe, what you see is here's the Soviet Union, and they were able to influence these countries kind of in Eastern Europe to become communist. And this really created that buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the rest of the West. And for our part, we were able to help kind of influence Italy and Austria and Switzerland and some of these more Western European countries to become democratic and really help, once again, create a buffer between France and United Kingdom and all those kinds of things. So it was really kind of about creating this buffer zone, but to do that, you had to influence these countries to become either communist or to become democratic. And the way you influence them was, as these countries are all rebuilding from being destroyed and devastated during the war, is you would give them money, you would give them weapons, you would help rebuild their cities, all of those kinds of things. But the condition for getting that money and that support and that help was they had to set up your form of government, either a democracy or a communist type of government, and show your allegiance to either the Soviet Union or to the Western democracies. When we look more on a global scale, and you can kind of see once this all kind of works itself out after a number of years, as you can see all this blue area, this is all places that we and the rest of Western Europe was able to influence to become democracy, right? You can see all the red. This is where the Soviet Union had its influence, and you can see not just in Eastern Europe, but also down in places like Afghanistan. We struggled in places like Iran and Egypt, Pakistan, China, North Vietnam, North Korea. A lot of these places became communist and got support from the Soviet Union. So we were always struggling and working to influence these regions as well. But that comes in the next part when we actually get into the Cold War and we fight in the Cold War. So now that we're full-blown into the Cold War and we just do not like the Soviet Union at all, we have very different philosophies from them, and we've created those buffer zones, what happens is over the next 30 to 40 years, we start to fight what are known as proxy wars. And the reality is this: the United States is a major superpower on the planet. We've developed nuclear weapons, we've won World War II, our economy is going really strong, we're doing really well. The Soviet Union, another very large country, very proud nation, they are doing okay, they're rebuilding after the wars. They also have developed nuclear weapon technology. And so, but we also know that fighting over Germany and what to do and how to influence people in that region has also made us mortal enemies. Well, at this point, nobody wants to go to war anymore. And we also, at this point, also understand that if we do ever go to war head to head with one another, that nuclear weapons would be launched and we would destroy the planet 10 times over and no one would survive that. So there's kind of a known idea now that we can't actually fight head to head anymore. So now what we need to do is we need to try to influence as many different countries on the planet as we can to be on our side, right? That's the way you can show that you're a big, powerful, strong nation, is by having lots and lots of friends and lots of allies. And the way to do that is to get them to convert to your way of life. So what you see then is in certain regions, we fight what are known as proxy wars. So for example, in Vietnam, right? Vietnam has some borders with the Soviet Union and some of their influence areas. And so the people in the north of Vietnam wanted to become communists. So of course they want their entire country to be that way. Well, some people in the south did not want to become communist and they wanted to be democratic. And so we wanted to support them. So what we do in a proxy war, since we can't fight head to head with the Soviet Union because we'll blow the planet up, is we will support our side with money, with weapons, with troops that train their troops and how to support their troops and all that kind of stuff. And so in the South, we provided a lot of money, a lot of weapons, a lot of troops to help the South Vietnamese fight against the North. And the North Vietnamese, of course, were fighting with the support of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was giving them money and weapons and troops and support. And so the Soviet troops and our US troops rarely ever met in combat, but we really let the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese fight that battle for us, right? But really it was us vying for influence in the region. Same with Korea, did the same thing. North Korea is communist, South Korea democratic. We supported the South, Soviet Union supported the North, right? We even competed in places like space. Who's going to be the first person to put somebody on the moon? Who's going to be the first one to send a spaceship or a satellite into orbit? And so we competed even at that level because that would show the world which country had the best technology and was more advanced. And that was more about national pride and which country was the biggest and the best, right? And so we competed in that front. We were the first to put someone on the moon. The Soviet Union was the first to put something into space. We competed in the Middle East. We helped Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan, some of these other countries, and so we were supporting both sides at the same time and letting them just fight it out. We fought it out in Africa. Cuba, Cuban Missile Crisis, Fidel Castro. We actually thought Fidel Castro was a good guy until he all of a sudden showed us that he was a communist. And then he got support from the Soviet Union, and so then we hated Fidel Castro. China, in the south of China, they wanted to be democratic. In the north, they wanted to be communist. And so there was some major civil war going on there, and eventually the communists won out. We competed down in South America. So all of these proxy wars were being fought between the people of these nations. The Vietnamese were fighting one another, but the two superpowers were the ones supporting them and backing them based on their own philosophies. And so that's why they're proxy wars. A proxy is somebody who does the work for you while you get the benefit from that. And so that's really what the Cold Wars are all about, and that's what we'll be studying going into this unit.